Hi, boys. Welcome to Friday's Daddy Cast. We're reading The Kings of Rome, Week 5, the Tarpeian Rock. The tribes who had been at the feast of Consus were so angry with the king that many of them went to fight against him without waiting to gather together a large army. Thus, Romulus soon defeated and scattered his foes. Moreover, having slain one of the kings with his own hand, he stripped him of his armor, and tying it to a pole, carried it back to Rome, where he offered it to Jupiter. This was the earliest triumph celebrated at Rome. In days to come, the triumphs of the Roman generals became famous. They were held when the soldiers returned victorious from a great battle. The general, at the head of his army, rode into the city in a chariot drawn by beautiful horses. Other chariots followed, filled with the treasures and spoils of war, while the most noble prisoners, often loaded with chains, were put to death. The day on which a triumph was celebrated was always held as a holiday by the citizens of Rome. Now, among the tribes which Romulus had robbed, none had suffered so heavily as the Sabines. But they, more wary than the king's other foes, did not attempt to avenge their wrongs until they had had time to collect a large and powerful army. Nearly 2 years had passed before this army was led by Tatius, the king of the Sabines, against the Romans. The fortress on the Capitoline hill Romulus had entrusted to the care of a chief named Tarpeius. Now Tarpeius had a daughter named Tarpeia, and she loved ornaments and jewels of gold and silver. As the Sabines, led by Tatius, drew near to attack the fortress, Tarpeia looked out of a spy hole and saw that the enemy was adorned with beautiful golden bracelets. The longer she looked, the greater became her desire to possess these dazzling ornaments. What would she not do to wear such splendid jewels? She would, yes, she would even betray the fortress into the hands of the Sabines, if only she might hear the tinkle of the golden bracelets on her arms. So, leaving the spy hole, Tarpeia slipped secretly out of the fortress and spoke to the Sabines, offering to show them how to take the citadel if they would give her, in reward, what they wore on their left arms. The Sabines agreed to do as Tarpeia wished, but in their hearts they despised the maiden for her treachery. But she, heedless of all save the ornaments that would soon be hers, hastened back to the fortress. Then, when it grew dark, she stealthily opened the gate, outside of which stood the waiting foe. As the Sabines marched into the fortress, Tarpeia cried to them to remember their promise and give her her reward. Then Tatius bade his men not to refuse the least part of what they wore on their left arms, and himself, taking off his bracelet, threw it to her, together with his shield, which he also bore on his left arm. His men did as their king had done. Shortly after, Tarpeia's greed was the death of her. The traitress was buried on the hill which she had betrayed. From that day, traitors were punished by being thrown over the steepest rock on the Capitoline hill, which was named after the maiden who betrayed her city, the Tarpeian rock. The mysterious gate. The fortress on the Capitoline hill was now in the hands of the Sabines, but they still had to fight with the Romans who dwelt on the Palatine hill. Romulus was indeed already to be seen leading his men into the valley that lay between the two mountains. The battle was long and fierce, and disaster well nigh overtook the Sabines. In the valley was a swamp, and in this swamp the whole of the enemy's army would have been engulfed, had not Curtius, one of their most gallant soldiers, warned them of danger. He himself had been carried by his horse into the mire. Nobly he tried to free his steed, but his efforts were all in vain. The more the animal struggled, the deeper it sank into the swamp, until at length Curtius was forced to leave his horse so that he might save himself. This swamp was ever after known as the Curtian Lake. Hour after hour the battle raged, until at last Romulus and his followers were driven backward. In their dismay, the Roman army rushed through one of the gates into their city, hastily shutting it behind them so that the foe might not also enter. But lo, so says the legend, the gate would not remain shut, but opened, as it seemed, of its own accord. Twice again the terrified Romans tried to close it, and twice it opened as mysteriously as before. The Sabines reached the gate as it opened for the last time. In through the open gate pushed the triumphant enemy, when suddenly a great flood of water gushed forth from the temple of the god Janus, which stood near to the gate. Overwhelmed by the force of the water, the Sabines were swept not only out of the gate, but far away from the city, and Rome was saved. But although the Sabines had been forced to flee, they had not been conquered. Again and again they marched against Romulus, for they could not forgive him for the loss of their daughters. In one of these battles, Romulus was wounded by a stone and fell to the ground. His followers, seeing that their king was wounded, lost courage and began to retreat. But the king was soon on his feet, calling to his men to stand and fight. But it seemed as though they dared not turn to face the foe. Then, in his great need, the king stretched out his hands to heaven and besought Jupiter to come to his aid, promising that he would build a temple to his name if only he would stay the flight of his army. Even as he prayed, the answer came. No voice from heaven commanded them to stand, yet the Romans were suddenly ashamed of their cowardice and turned once more to face the foe. But as the battle was about to begin with redoubled fury, the Sabine women rushed in between the two armies with loud cries, entreating now their fathers and brothers, now their husbands, to end this cruel slaughter. In their arms, the women carried their little sons, and these babes stretched out their tiny arms toward their grandsires as though they too would beg for peace. The lamentable cries of their daughters, the sight of their little grandchildren, made the Sabines hesitate, and soon the warriors in either army let their weapons fall to the ground in mood no longer warlike. Then fathers and son-in-laws clasped hands in friendship. The old men embraced their daughters and carried their baby grandsons on their shields. Surely a sweeter way was that to use the shield. Peace was then made, and the Romans and Sabines agreed to become one, while Romulus and Tatius ruled together over their united people. 5 years later, Tatius was killed in a quarrel, and Romulus again ruled alone. The illustration on this page is called Reconciliation between the Romans and the Sabines, an etching from 1818.